All right, welcome everyone to the last day of the Spring NNP Symposium. We are working with Central States for the second time this year, so we have an in-person option as well as viewers online. The entire symposium is funded by the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society, or EPNUS. So we're very grateful to them and excited to be back at Central States again this year. So we've got two more presentations left today. So thank you for everyone who is sticking it out until the end. For this one, we are here with Jeff Pritchard for What Happened in Holland. Jeff is a lifelong numismatist and a retired financial planner. He's the author of numerous books and has written for the Go Broke Journal, the ANA Reading Room, and the CPG Coin and Currency Market Review recently. So Jeff, I'm going to let you take it away, and I'll be back at the end for the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you, Leanna. And thank you to the Eric P. Newman Education Society for hosting this event. I've been watching some of these presentations, and it's really a great accumulation of expertise and knowledge. Leanna and I were joking before this that one of the nice things about sticking it out and coming to a presentation like this late in a coin show is that you're always guaranteed a good seat. So what did happen in Holland? You know, that sounds like an old Agatha Christie mystery or something. And actually, that was my intent, because the crux of this presentation is to unravel or reveal a numismatic mystery. I have a little problem, my slides not advancing. There we go. Well, ever since ancient Roman times, when Romans would place a small woolen cap ceremoniously atop a freed slave's head, that small cap became a symbol for freedom and liberty, and hence we all know it as the Liberty Cap. And during the American Revolution, and most predominantly during the French Revolution, the style of Liberty Cap became known as the Phrygian style Liberty Cap. And this is the cap we're all familiar with. It's a soft cloth cap tilted forward. And because it became such a symbol, such an icon around the world, representing liberty, representing freedom, it appears on a great deal of our coinage. And it certainly appears on our US coinage. We're familiar with it on the Morgan dollar, on all the barber coinage. We see it on the Mercury dime. Although I think most of you know that the Mercury dime is really a stubborn nickname. That was intended to be liberty, with the Phrygian style Liberty hat atop of it, or atop of her, and the wings representing freedom of thought. But the public liked the Mercury nickname, and so it stuck. But we've seen the Liberty Cap on coinage throughout the world. We see it on French coinage. We see it on the coins and medals of Great Britain. It's on Mexican coins. There it is in between the 2 and the 0. The coin on the right is from Paraguay, which clearly has the Liberty Cap atop a staff. In fact, if you look at Central and South America, there's probably a dozen countries that either have or currently have the Liberty Cap on their coinage. Even in the Caribbean, we see it on the coins of Haiti. It's there atop of that palm tree on the left. Ironically, it's even on the coins of Cuba. And in Africa, it's appeared on the coins of Liberia. And the key here is all the countries around the world who utilize the Liberty Cap to portray freedom always portray it as that soft cloth Phrygian style Liberty Cap. All of them, except one, and that's the Netherlands. The Netherlands portrays the Liberty Cap. In fact, they actually call it the Freedom Hat. They portray it as more of a traditional hat, broad-brimmed hat. And that's the mystery that I kind of encountered and was looking to resolve, is why, apart from all the other countries in the world, does the Netherlands portray the Liberty Cap, or Freedom Hat as they call it, in the way that they do? And so to address this, we're going to kind of have a geography primer. I know for myself, you look at the Netherlands and Holland and Dutch, and easily to get confused. And then the bulk of the presentation is about the Dutch maiden, and the freedom hat. We're going to talk very briefly about the 80 Years' War because this was the catalyst that created a real surge in patriotism and nationalism in the Netherlands that was a real influencer of this freedom hat. And although there's no definitive explanation, certainly not in English, of why the Dutch used this unusual hat to portray freedom and liberty, as we go through the chronology, it'll become pretty apparent why that's the case. And then a couple of, I guess, sidelines or bonus areas is that during the course of this research, and covered some interesting side notes, and one I call the rescuing of John Adams. This, of course, our second president. And finally, how the freedom hat ended up in Connecticut, of all places. So let's start with our geography. These are the current boundaries of the Netherlands in green, Belgium in yellow, and Luxembourg down in the pink. And these boundaries are essentially the same as they were at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Despite World War I, despite World War II, these boundaries are pretty much the same as they were a couple hundred years ago. We really have to go further back in time to 1433 to really understand the formation of the Netherlands. This is an area that encompasses today Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and parts of France. And it was comprised of 17 provinces, which were called the Low Countries. In fact, the Netherlands, in translation, means the Low Countries. And these areas were all united in 1433 by the Duke of Burgundy. And henceforth, they were called the Burgundian Netherlands. Well, about 150 years later, in 1581, the 7 most northern provinces of this group declared their independence. They formally adopted the Treaty of Utrecht in 1581, and they, just as our own Declaration of Independence in 1776, they broke free, declaring their independence from that broad group of other provinces. And this was shortly after the start of the 80 Years' War. Now, the real unifying factor for these 7 provinces was the Protestant religion. At this time, as I'll explain, they were being kind of ruled by Spain, and Spain was Catholic, and these 7 provinces broke free for religious purposes. Well, to start solving our puzzle, we have to meet one of probably the most overlooked figures in history. And this is the Dutch equivalent of the Liberty Goddess, or Libertas. And she goes by many names. The Maiden of Dordrecht, which is a city in Holland, the Dutch Virgin, the Maid of the Union, the Dutch Maiden, the Maiden of Holland, Hollandia, Batavia Liberty. And I have to kind of apologize. I tend to use these interchangeably throughout the presentation. But she's overlooked because, particularly in numismatics, I've listened to a lot of very scholarly webinars and presentations on the appearance of liberty or libertas over time on coinage throughout the ages. Listened to a number of webinars on women images on coinage throughout the ages. And I've actually never heard any mention of our Maiden of Holland here. Now, this is an image of the Maiden of Holland, one of the first appearances of her on a statue. And it was done in 1618 in the city of Dordrecht. It appears on their main city gate, but it was copied from a very earlier painting in 1549 in the city of Dordrecht. And you can see her picture. I'll have obviously some better images, but she's sitting in a walled garden surrounded by a low, what's called a wattle style fence with a gate in front. She's protecting that walled garden. In her left hand, she has a palm frond. You can see on her head, it's pictured a hat. And this is intended to be a carried forward from that Roman Peleus-style liberty cap placed on the heads of freed slaves. But obviously, this doesn't look anything like the Phrygian-style liberty cap that appears on our coinage that we're so familiar with. It looks more like a traditional hat, but it was intended to represent freedom and liberty. Well, about the same point in time in the numismatic world, we had the very first appearance of the liberty cap appearing on a coin since Roman times. In fact, there had been a 1,200-year gap from the time that the liberty cap appeared on Roman coinage to this point in time. And this was in 1552 on a French medal. And you can see the engraver has portrayed the liberty cap as more of just a traditional hat, certainly nothing like the liberty caps we're familiar with. And the point of this is that during the time the Dutch were casting about for symbols and images to unite or inspire the people, they were working with pretty much a blank slate. This was 250 years before the American or the French Revolution, 200 years or more before the American Revolution. So the Dutch were working with no preconceived notions of what the liberty cap, freedom hat, as they call it, was intended to look like. This is a stained glass window done in the late 1500s. And it's a little better image of our Maiden of Holland or Maiden of Dordrecht. You can see now clearly she is seated in this garden, this peaceful pasture setting, surrounded by the low wattle-style fence and the gate, which represents the Netherlands. She has what's called the martyr's palm in her hand. Now, in early Christianity, the palm was a symbol of victory of the spirit over the flesh. And she's wearing a flower wreath. It's interesting, this walled garden metaphor, this is where it originated. And we don't really hear of it too much today, although coincidentally, I was reading a Wall Street Journal article about a month ago, and we're talking about how Apple was being pursued by the Department of Justice because of the way they had made it difficult for those with a different type of phone to access ads. And the journalist had used the phrase that Apple had created a walled garden. Again, it's not something we hear very frequently, but this is where that metaphor began. So everything changes during the 80 Years' War. And this ran from 1568 to 1648 between the Spanish and the Dutch. And the origination of the war, and this is, of course, what really spurred the adoption of the Treaty of Utrecht and those 7 provinces breaking away. The Low Countries, those 17 provinces, part of the Habsburg Empire. And the Habsburg Empire was ruled by Charles V. But in 1515, he left the territory to go and become King of Spain. He actually ended up being emperor of the entire Holy Roman Empire. But the regions that he left in charge of the Netherlands owed their fealty to Charles. And so, in a sense, the Netherlands clearly were being ruled by Spain. And this was tolerable until 1556, when Philip II ascended to the Spanish throne. Like most in Spain at that time, Philip II was an ardent Catholic who believed that the Protestant religion was heresy. And once Philip II took control of Spain, he began to impose significant religious persecution on the Netherlands. He brought the Spanish Inquisition methods to the Netherlands. And in addition, he tried to basically eliminate the Dutch culture, the Dutch traditions. And so during this course, there was a huge surge in patriotism, in nationalism within the Netherlands. And our Maiden of Holland and the Freedom Hat became extremely important symbols during this period as a means of unifying the country and inspiring the country. Well, we see the first kind of coinage representation of this. This is a 1573 penny, essentially. And you can see we've got our Maiden of Holland sitting in that walled garden. This is on the obverse, surrounded by the wattle style fence and the gate. But she's no longer holding a palm frond. She's holding a sword, defending the garden, defending the Netherlands from the invaders. And the circumference says freedom for the fatherland in Latin. But you can see that there's a hat now on our Dutch maiden, no longer a flower wreath. And this is the freedom hat that was on the statue of the that we looked at earlier. Historians have observed that the style of hat on this coin and others that I'll show you is what's called a capitaine hat. Now, we all know that style of hat as that was worn by the pilgrims, as in Plymouth Rock. The pilgrims, Calvinist Protestants, as were the majority of the people in those 7 northern provinces. And so selecting a hat to, again, carry forward that freedom and liberty connotation from Roman times, but to choose a hat that had Protestant affiliation really makes all the sense in the world, as you'll see going forward. This is another important medal from the Dutch, struck in 1577, and it's considered historically important because it's the, quote, first appearance of the Liberty Goddess in modern numismatics. And again, the Goddess of Liberty hadn't appeared on coinage since Roman times. Now, in reality, this is a bit of semantics because this is clearly intended to portray the Maiden of Holland, albeit less modestly attired. So whether it's the Maiden of Holland, whether it's liberty, because she represented liberty in Holland, could make that case. But she is holding the Dutch-style freedom hat in her right hand. In her left hand, she holds a staff, which is certainly similar with how libertas is often portrayed on Roman coinage, holding a staff. But there's also that palm frond at the top of the staff. At her feet is the Belgic lion, which we will see as a symbol used more and more frequently in coinage, in art, in culture, on the medals. The other element off to the side here, to the Maiden of Holland's right, those are intended to be broken chains and broken shackles. And this is a theme that carries forward in, again, art, culture, numismatics. I think many don't realize that in New York Harbor, at the feet of our own Statue of Liberty, are broken chains, created by the artist in 1876. But again, it's a theme that repeats itself quite frequently in numismatics and in art and culture. Well, our Maiden of Holland began to appear very frequently, certainly during the 80 Years' War, throughout many areas, again, within the Netherlands. This is a painting done between 1615, 1630. And for those of you who are art experts, I had to lighten this up quite a bit because as in most paintings of the era, it's faded to be quite dark. But in this, we see our Maiden of Holland holding the freedom hat, the Dutch-style freedom hat, atop of a lance. And this becomes how it's portrayed going forward, kind of symbolizing that effort to gain their freedom, gain their liberty through war, through the 80 Years' War. The figure to her left, to our right, holding the lance with her is intended to be Moritz, who is an ancestor of William of Orange. So a unifying symbol of both of them holding that lance together with the freedom hat atop of it. Well, our Maiden of Holland is, she begins to be portrayed wearing a battle helmet. This is from a frontispiece, which is essentially the front of a book. And this originally appeared in 1632. And this has our Maiden of Holland pictured around the banners, the various Dutch provinces, engaged in the war, surrounded by weapons. And very prominently in this image, she's holding a lance. Again, which supports the freedom hat going forward. And again, she is no longer wearing a flower wreath. She is no longer wearing freedom hat, but she is wearing a battle helmet. Now, this is another example of the appearance of the freedom hat and our Dutch maiden in kind of everyday culture. Obviously, this is dark, so a little hard to see, but this is what's called a fireback. And as the name implies, wealthier families would put this back of their fireplaces. These were cast iron. This one from 1644 is actually a fairly famous version. And these firebacks had two purposes. One was to radiate the heat back out into the room. The other was to protect the bricks. Those of you who have fireplaces and use them a lot will know that after prolonged exposure to high heat, a lot of bricks will crack and break. And so this was intended to protect that. On it, we can see the wattle style fence and the gate down at the bottom. We can see our Maiden of Holland with a very ornate battle helmet on, holding a lance with that Capitain style freedom hat atop the lance. But she now has an ally in the garden, and that's the Belgic lion, who will appear more and more in coinage on medals throughout the art. But the lion is holding something else aside from the sword in his paw, which obviously signifying he's defending the garden, defending the Netherlands. But in his other paw, he's got arrows, 7 arrows. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, that probably represents 1 arrow for every province. You know, they're all fighting Spain. That makes sense. But it's actually a little deeper meaning. And it relates to what's the legend of King Scilurus, who was king of the Scythians. We all know that legend because Aesop borrowed it. And the legend, again, I think we all know from as kids, is that King Scilurus was getting old in years, and so he called together all his sons. Now, in the legend of King Scilurus, he actually has 80 sons. That's 80, which is pretty legendary in its own right. But he calls together his sons, and he's bundled together this group of arrows. And he asked each son to try and break the bundle, and whoever could, well, he would be able to be king. Well, they all took the bundle and they tried, and this was a thick bundle of arrows, and none of them, of course, could break the bundle. And so Scilurus took the bundle back, he unwrapped them, and methodically, slowly broke each arrow one at a time. And of course, representing the strength in numbers. And this ties in with what was the Dutch motto or national motto at this time, which was unity makes strength, discord breaks strength. And we see this certainly echoed in our own revolution, probably most eloquently stated by Benjamin Franklin, who said, "We must all indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." So again, this symbolism of unity, which was so important for the Netherlands at this time. Well, the 80 Years' War concludes. Netherlands has won their freedom from Spain. And this is a coin that was introduced in 1681. It was on this design, Auber's design was on the 3 guilder, the 1 guilder, and the half guilder. And it had a pretty long run, just like our own Lincoln penny. This was design was used for over 100 years, up until 1800. But we can see on the obverse, we've got our Maiden of Holland. Now, one thing of note is that going forward, the garden is gone. And you'll see that on subsequent images. The garden has all but disappeared in our images of the Maiden of Holland. She is wearing the ornate battle helmet. She is holding the lance. When you look down at her feet, you can very clearly see, yes, that's a lance, that's a weapon, with that Capitain style freedom hat atop of it. She's leaning on the item atop the altar or pillar is a Bible. And we have to remember how Bibles were back here in the 1600s. even ones done by Gutenberg were very large leather-bound documents with the metal clasp and all whatnot. But leaning on the Bible, again, underscoring the religious significance of the 80 Years' War and of the Netherlands winning their independence. Well, this is a bit of a detour, but it's one of my favorite examples of how the Dutch maiden permeated so many areas of society at this point in time during this 100 or 200 years. This is actually an engraving of Maria Marianne. Now, Maria Marianne, and it was done in 1717, which is actually the year of her death, but she was a national hero in the Netherlands. Just as we know John James Audubon as a naturalist who tried to paint all the birds in North America, Marianne was a naturalist in the Netherlands who painted insects and plants, but she achieved national and international prominence. And so she was highly regarded. She certainly provided a very important role model for women of this era because she shattered the glass ceiling at a very early time. But in this engraving to honor her, if you look over her shoulder, there on a shelf is a small figurine of our Maiden of Holland, holding the lance, holding the freedom cap. The small figurine next to the Maiden of Holland is the winged figure blowing a trumpet that represents fame. But it's interesting, again, how deeply our Maiden of Holland has gotten into so many areas of the Dutch culture at this point in time. Well, our Maiden of Holland probably achieved her, I guess, kind of the height of her prominence when she became part of the Netherlands national emblem. She no longer has her battle helmet. The garden is gone. We get a few bushes, I guess, representing that. But she clearly, again, holding the lance, holding a weapon, with the freedom hat perched on top of it. So, in going through this chronology that we have, in looking to unravel the mystery, again, although there's not a definitive explanation, it becomes pretty apparent why the Dutch had such an unusual style of liberty cap. When they were casting about in need of symbols to inspire and unify the country, they were working with a blank slate. This was several hundred years before the American Revolution or the French Revolution that really made that Phrygian style liberty cap an international icon. The other element, of course, is that the 80 Years' War, it was a religious war. It wasn't about taxation without representation. It wasn't about land. It was about the Spanish Catholics trying to eliminate the Dutch Protestants. So totally unrelated to some other areas that, such as manumission and whatnot. And finally, of course, is that the freedom hat resembles that Capotain style freedom hat worn by Calvinist Protestants in this era. And so using a hat that not only had ties to that original Roman manumission ceremony of the freeing of the slaves, but a hat that had Protestant connotations really made all the sense in the world. Now, I guess two sidelines that I discovered during this research that I thought were interesting that related to the freedom cap. And the first is what I call the rescuing of John Adams' career. So they really didn't rescue him, they rescued his career. As you all know, John Adams was our second president and first vice president. Well, in 1778, John Adams had really distinguished himself with the Continental Congress for his international expertise and international common sense. And so the Continental Congress asked him to go to France to assist in our negotiating for military support, trade agreements, loans, things we needed. If you remember, at this time, the revolution was obviously very much in doubt and quite frankly didn't look like the Americans were going to win. So John Adams dutifully goes to France. But of course, Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee had already been there. And what Adams discovered is they had already successfully negotiated with the French for military support, loans, and things of that nature. So Adams originally thought it would make sense just to go back home. Well, he discovered once he was there for a few weeks that Franklin and Lee detested one another. They didn't get along, and what Adams was worried about was that um, discord would hurt our relations with France, that they would see the two bickering and arguing and think, well, you guys can't even get along. What about the country? So Adams felt he needed to stay on. If nothing else, he would be the tie-breaking vote if those two could never reach an agreement. Well, he stayed there until late 1779, really doing very little. So Adams returned to Boston in 1779. But a few months later, the Continental Congress asked him to go back to Europe, this time to work with the Netherlands, again, to try and secure military support, loans, trade agreements, and whatnot. So Adams returns to France, but to get to the Netherlands from France, he needs the approval of the French foreign minister, a gentleman named Gravier. But Gravier didn't want to help Adams get to the Netherlands because Franklin had sort of poisoned the well. Franklin had done some underhanded things, kind of to hurt Adams' reputation. He told Gravier that Adams couldn't be trusted, that he was a British sympathizer. Did some underhanded things. Well, after about 4 months, Adams did finally gain Gravier's acceptance. Adams was able to go to the Netherlands. And there he stayed from 1780 to late 1781 with no progress being made. And the reason I say rescue his career is Adams was clearly one of the leaders leading up to our own revolution. But here he had spent 2 years in France, almost 2 years in Amsterdam, with nothing to show for it. And Adams, throughout his whole career, both before and after his presidency, even up to his retirement, in his letters, in his diaries, he was very concerned with his historical legacy. He was very worried about how he was going to be remembered. And so these 4 years that were essentially dead time, where he accomplished very, very little, were a real concern. And that all changed with the Battle of Yorktown. In October of 1781, Cornwallis's surrender and the surrender of 9,000 British troops had clearly changed the course of the war. And because of that, with it now being apparent that these little 13 colonies were actually going to win, the Netherlands finally, in early 1782, recognized the United States and recognized John Adams as the official envoy. And that was a huge political win for John Adams. Now, of course, as you would expect at this era, the Dutch created about 6 or 7 medals in commemoration of this. This one commemorates Friesland's recognition of the United States. Friesland is one of those 7 provinces. Holland is another one of those 7 provinces. But we can see on the obverse here on the left, we've got an Indian princess. And at this time, when Europe was portraying America in art, America was portrayed as an Indian princess. So this is the Dutch engraver's impression of what an Indian princess was supposed to look like. On her shield, it says the United States of North America. The figure in the center is supposed to represent the Netherlands. And the woman on the far right, Great Britain, extending an olive branch. And we can see the angelic figure in the clouds is extending that freedom hat, that Dutch style freedom hat, to the American princess. One of the other items, if you look closely, down at the feet of the Indian princess, she's standing on a scepter, which is appropriate. But by her shield are 2 broken shackles. Again, tying with that metaphor that continues on coinage and metals for quite a while, and that is that broken shackles or chains at the feet of liberty. This is another medal in 1782. Holland receives John Adams as envoy. And we see here on the obverse, we've got our Maiden of Holland on the left, wearing a battle helmet, holding the freedom hat above the Indian princess. And our Indian princess, there are 13 stars on her shield. She is standing, her left foot is standing on the neck of the lion that is tended to represent Great Britain. One of the interesting things I noticed in these medals is that whenever the Maiden of Holland is portrayed, either alone or maybe with a group of others, it's very clear that it's a lance, that it's a weapon. The bottom of the lance is portrayed on those medals, on those coins. But when the Dutch Maiden is portrayed reaching out in friendship, such as this, or in fact on the kind of that faded image I've got as a background, that's actually on a 1783 piece of Paris Treaty medal. But whenever she's reaching out in friendship, the lance, the bottom of the lance is hidden. So you can't see it's a weapon that is holding the freedom hat. This is another medal, again, from 1782 in the Netherlands. And we've got our Maiden of Holland on the obverse, holding in her right hand the lance, clearly a lance in this case, with the freedom hat atop of it, and those 7 arrows, again representing the unity that the Netherlands had to maintain during the course of the 80 Years' War. Now, one other medal I'll show you, this is not related to John Adams, but since it's one I own, I thought I'd sneak it in. But it entails a lot of the images and symbols we've been talking about. This is done in 1785 by the Netherlands, celebrating the treaty Fontainebleau. And since it doesn't relate with America in any way, it doesn't have a Betts catalog number. But in the obverse, you can see the eagle, it's supposed to be an eagle, flying over on the left. That represents Austria. This was a treaty between the Holy Roman Empire and the Netherlands. That flower in the very center is a lily representing France. And over on the right, we have our Belgic lion holding a sword, the lance with the Dutch style freedom hat over his shoulder. And in his front left paw, again, you have to look closely, the 7 arrows, that symbol of unity that the Netherlands had. The inscription at the bottom of this obverse, not in Latin, but in Dutch, for those of you who don't read Dutch, which is myself included, it translates to the lily, representing France, prevented the battle, for the sword was bathed in human blood. Not exactly what you'd see on a bumper sticker, but interesting nonetheless. So the final sideline I wanted to touch upon, and this relates to how the freedom hat ended up in post-colonial America, of all places. And to look at this, and this is relating to the Connecticut copper tokens. And to kind of address this, we have to start with the Connecticut Copper Act of 1785. Now, this was passed because there was a terrible problem with counterfeit copper tokens at this point in time in this area. And the counterfeits were, grossly underweight. And so to try and solve that, the state house or state assembly in Connecticut passed this law, which designated 4 specific coiners that would have a monopoly on producing these copper tokens, copper coinage. And it prescribed what would be on the front and the back. In the back, the reverse, that's the larger size, was to have an emblem of liberty extending an olive branch. Now, the legislation didn't require that Liberty was holding a staff with a Liberty cap atop of it. This is another one that I own, and I actually, one of the few varieties, there's over 300 die combinations and over 125 type varieties of this. It's a very convoluted issue. But this is one of the few varieties where you can actually see the Liberty cap atop the staff. Well, as we all know, counterfeiters are pretty resourceful and pretty nimble. And so what the counterfeiters did was they just started counterfeiting these approved copper tokens. And counterfeits actually have a name of muttonhead related to the appearance of the obverse. But you can look at the reverse and compare it with what we just saw, and you can see it's pretty crude. Certainly doesn't really look an awful lot like Liberty. Conceptually, it's the same. It's a poor strike. There's not much lettering around the edges. But you'll note that the Liberty cap at the end of the staff looks different. In fact, the counterfeit experts on these tokens feel that that is intended to be a Dutch style freedom hat, not purposely, not the Liberty cap. And the reason for that is, and I think the best article on this was done by Oliver Hoover in 2007. We have to remember that this Hoover believes that this was done by the counterfeiters on purpose to ingratiate the coin. So the coin would be accepted by merchants and citizens in the greater New York area. And the reason for that is that the whole New York area was originally settled by the Dutch West India Company in 1625. In fact, it's the Dutch West India Company that kind of was behind the infamous purchase of Manhattan Island for 60 guilders from the Native Americans. But Hoover and other scholars believe that the counterfeiters were doing this because the inhabitants of the greater New York area were predominantly Dutch at this time. And they were familiar with that freedom hat design because it had been on coinage in the Netherlands for almost 200 years. And so the counterfeiters had done this to purposely represent the freedom hat so that the residents of the greater New York area would accept it. Now, in 1625, when the Dutch West India Company settled the area, they called it New Amsterdam. And of course, Great Britain took it over in 1664 and renamed it New York. That's why the tie with the freedom hat with the residents in that greater New York area. So an interesting side note of how our freedom hat wound up in post-colonial United States. So what of our Dutch maid? Well, she somewhat appeared to have outlived her usefulness. We've solved our mystery. We know that that was really because of the religious connotations of that style hat, but still tying back to the Roman freeing of slaves. The freedom hat helped boost John Adams' career kind of indirectly. And we've seen how the freedom hat even snuck into the Connecticut and New York area in the United States in the early era. But again, since that time, she's really outlived her usefulness. This is the most recent statue of her done in the Netherlands in 1874 in Rotterdam. And the most recent, actually, commercial image that I could find was done by T. van der Laars in 1913. And here we see our Dutch maiden seated in that walled garden. The wattle style fence is changed, but it's back, holding that freedom hat atop a staff, or what in reality is a lance. And of course, she is clothed in clothing of the early 1900s. Kind of an ironic period for this to appear because, shortly before World War I, where they could have used her help. But having been instrumental in the freeing of the Netherlands from Spain, again, our Maiden of Holland has tended to kind of fade away, both in kind of current cultural history and in numismatics. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Did you doze off, Leanna?
Not at all. All right, so we'll take I know we have one question that already came in online, so we're going to start off with that. If you are watching online, just click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and send them in. We'll have Len reading them off here in the room. So let's start off with that one.
All right, so first question, do you think the Maiden of Holland inspired Herman McNeil's Standing Liberty Quarter in 1916?
No. I think our Maiden of Holland, I think the problem is why she doesn't appear in webinars. It was 200 years before our own revolution or the French Revolution. And most of us tend to be pretty centric focused and kind of viewing our revolution as, boy, this is the thing that really set it off. And so I think the Maiden of Holland gets short shrift because it just was so long before our own revolution. And we're not very European focused as a nation.
All right. Do we have any questions in the room?
Yeah, I have a question. Go ahead.
What did you even start looking into this?
Was that what I thought it was? Why did I start looking into this?
Yes.
I haven't much to do. No, I was doing research on the Liberty. That's a good question. I was doing research on the Liberty Cap and seeing it throughout all these countries. And then I see the Dutch version, and it's kind of like makes no sense. I mean, I first thought, that looks like an Indiana Jones hat. Why in the world did they do that? Because every other country portrays it as the Phrygian style. And so started doing the research and again, uncovered some kind of interesting and overlooked pieces of history and certainly pieces of numismatic history.
Okay, then. Another question?
Yeah, another comment here regarding the Connecticut forgery. It's also possible to avoid a charge of forgery if you change the details. So you can claim your piece isn't really a fake of a legitimate coin, since the legitimate one doesn't have that exact design. This was a trick performed by forgers in Britain in the 18th century.
Okay. Yeah, I relied on the research of others who are specialists in that. And again, it was Oliver Hoover who wrote a pretty lengthy article. I think it appeared in the ANS journal, but makes a pretty compelling case that they were trying to ingratiate the coin with the people around the New York area.
Another comment, the copper coin you showed at the beginning, the sort of the first reuse of the Liberty Cap, that piece looked an awful lot like an Aidmar from the ancient Roman period. I don't know if that was deliberate, but I just thought it was interesting.
No, it is. And I have done another presentation and some articles that incorporate that. It is very similar. The Aidmar piece has the daggers pointing down, representing the assassination of Julius Caesar. This one had swords pointing up, but it is very reminiscent, really echoes that Aidmar, both the denarius and the gold aureus.
Okay. Do we have anything else online?
Nothing else.
Not currently. Okay, then last call in the room. Okay, then that's probably going to wrap us up. If you have any last minute questions online, send them in now. Otherwise, thank you so much, Jeff, for taking the time out to present. Always happy to have you. And then we will be back at 4:30. We've got Russ Vega and Mike Nodelman with some tales from over the counter, which should be a good time. And as always, a reminder, all of these are being recorded. The recordings will be up in about 2 to 3 weeks on the Newman Numismatic Portal, as well as YouTube. If you would like to be notified when those are available, you can follow us on any of the social media platforms where you can find us, or subscribe to our mailing list. You can find that on the homepage of our website, or sign up on a paper at the front of the room here. So that's it for us. Hope you'll be back to join us at 4:30 Central for the last presentation of this symposium. Thank you.